So we have 2 hours for this learning lab, and I think it will be tight because of all the of the whole program that we arranged. So for this learning lab, designing a smartphone application, I will present this learning lab together with my colleagues from Wageningen Economic Research, which is part of Wageningen University. And that's my colleague Valerie, and that's Jos van der Puttelaar. And we're all involved in this project. And Valerie is an expert on impact assessment, and Jos and I are experts in consumer behavior in relation to food and nutrition and food technology. So we have different objectives for this learning lab. And in this learning lab, we incorporated all the lessons that we have learned in our own project itself. So last year, or actually the last 2 or 3 years, we were working in the Enrich project, which is a project that was funded by the IMANA grant. And in this project, we designed and validated a tool to measure food and vegetable intake and food choice motives of urban Kenyan consumers. So in this developing process, we learned a lot. And that is what we wanted to present today. So we're no smartphone developers ourselves, but we looked at it from our research perspective. So these are the 3 main goals, and one of the main objectives is to understand the steps and the processes that you should take into account in developing a tool, a smartphone tool for measuring food choice motives or food consumption behavior. So this is the outline of our learning lab today. So as you can see, it's quite a full program. So first I will start with a little bit about the context of smartphone usage and ownership in combination with research, followed by an overview of the different types of research applications. And then we go to when you should use a smartphone application, what are the criteria when you should consider a smartphone application in your research, and then about development and the approach. So in our case, we will use the Enrich study, and we also included some exercises or assignments for you, so that you can also have your own case study, and we'll take you to all the steps for designing your own mock-ups for your smartphone application. And further on, we have the preparation of the survey, what should you take into account, the sampling procedures, and also the pitfalls. So what have you taken into account and what have we learned? And as last, we have also the implementation tools, because next to the bot that we have developed in the Enrich study, we have other tools developed and designed within Wageningen Economic Research and Wageningen University that we wanted to show you. So this is the whole program. Oh, sorry. And if you have any questions, please ask them during the presentation. If I talk like this, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I feel more comfortable talking like this than with the microphone.
Actually, I think that because it's a recording.
Okay.
Do you need it? I need that.
You have to use that.
You need to take the microphone for recording.
Okay. So the first one, smartphones and research. So the ownership of smartphones is increasing, and is also increasing in developing countries such as sub-Saharan Africa. And what you can see from this figure is that the numbers of people that own a smartphone in sub-Saharan Africa is increasing. So what you can see is that about 1/3 of the adults owns a smartphone. And when you look at the numbers, it differs geographically across the world. Because when you look at Asia or in Latin America, the number of people that own a smartphone is higher than in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the numbers of specific countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what you can see is that the numbers of people that have that own a smartphone increased from 2013 to 2017, and it increased significantly in South Africa, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and in Kenya. So what you can see from these figures is that the use or the application of a smartphone tool in your research might be interesting. So when you look at food consumption behavior, you should take into account that the consumer doesn't exist, because consumers differ in many ways. They have different motives, they have different reasons, they have different desires and different wishes in their food choices. So when you take food consumption behavior into account, you should not only look, for example, at the intake, but you should also consider the different consumer characteristics that people have. So people differ in their religion, in their life course, in their health status, but also in their own knowledge. For example, knowledge on healthy consumption, or about their attitudes or about their preferences. And all these choices differ also across context. So it matters when a person consumes a food at home or on the go, or it might also differ in the season, because the foods that are available differ across the seasons. So there are a lot of things that you should take into account when you want to receive insights in food consumption behavior. So there are different methods to get insights in those needs, desires, and the gaps of consumers. And one of the methods that you can use are different types of questionnaires. So normally we use in our research a lot of qualitative or quantitative research, and therefore we use, for example, also different types of questionnaires. And which one you apply just depends on the context, on your objective. And we mentioned here 4 different ones. So you've got the paper-based questionnaire. That's a questionnaire just on paper that people have to fill in themselves. So it's a self-reported questionnaire. Then you also have the web-based questionnaire. So that's actually the paper-based questionnaire on the internet. So people can fill in the questionnaire on the internet, on their computer, or on the tablet. And in the Netherlands, for example, we use quite a lot of the web-based questionnaires. And then we also have the semi-structured. We also have the semi-structured questionnaires. In that case, a field worker will read out loud all the questions to the participants. And then the next one is, you're collecting your data with a research application, and that's the focus of this learning lab. So let's move on to the first exercise. As we focus in this case, or in this learning lab, on smartphones, we are really interested in what do you think are the advantage and disadvantage of using a smartphone application for your data analysis compared to the other types of questionnaires. So the paper-based questionnaire, the web-based questionnaire that's on the computer or on the tablet. And we're curious to see what are your advantages and disadvantages, your pros and cons, to see if you feel the same at the end of this learning lab. Does everyone have a form?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So we're going to discuss a few of them, and Valerie will write some pros and cons down that you wrote down. So who would actually like to give their main answers already? Yeah, we have a few minutes, great.
Like the research application, this is less time taking. We don't have to fill the form. Or get the data entry thing. So it is less time consuming and labor consuming. And then second thing is that after the entry of the data, we get a ready-made Excel sheet, so we don't have to like do on that also. And disadvantage is that since we are too much dependency on the technology, there is threat of data loss. So once there is some problem in the application, then whole of your data is gone. So that is the risk.
In application, you can build validations where when entry is being made, there could be validations which is not possible in the paper-based questionnaire. Then you need not to enter data into the computer for analysis. You can easily transfer your data to your software or whatever it is, and then you can also build in alert messages in the questions, like if there is a number of children, and instead of putting 3, if it is being entered 30 by mistake, there could be alert message in the application which is not possible in the paper message. And some of the disadvantages are mobile literacy is a challenge. In some of the population, mobile literacy is poor, so this cannot be a very viable option. And then there are technical glitches with regards with associated with the computer with the mobile-based applications. And then in mobile applications, you have dependency on power, network, and other technological environment.
One more?
The major advantage of this application is easy to connect and easy to use, and which entry and correction goes at simultaneously. And where in paper-based questionnaire we can't collect the images or voice records, which can be done through this application. Sometimes the opinions matters, for which application is more important, and images more important for dietary data collection in nutrition and health point of view, and which can be shared through any media like WhatsApp, Facebook. The links can be shared to reach the wider people. That is also, and as I said, data validation is the major issue while collecting the data. So that can be with data validation techniques, we can use it in the app that can be controlled by this app also.
I have a question to, I'm not sure if it's you. Okay, so I'm wondering, because a lot of things that I hear that you're mentioning are actually also possible when you're using like web-based applications. So are there any thoughts from you what you think is the advantage of an app over the web-based applications?
Yeah. For example, if Google Forms are web-based application, usually we go by Google Forms at a small stage, and even for we can develop a web-based schedules, but it requires internet. Whereas app, it stores the information at the tab or mobile, and it can be transferred at later stage also. That is one of the advantages. And as we said, this data can be stored in different servers also. Even if you lost at one stage, we can get it from other servers. That means we can store it in cloud base.
Yeah.
Okay, that is also one of the advantages. But we have some threats also, since the data is being electronic form, that can be hacked by some other else until unless if it is not coded correctly. The recoding and coding, that encryption should be there.
Last one, okay?
And when I was speaking, I was just comparing it with the paper-based.
Yeah.
But if you ask me to compare it with the web-based, then one of the advantages are mobiles are handy. You can take them to the field, and also mobile literacy is higher than computer literacy. So from that angle, also mobile based applications are better than web-based applications.
you want to make one last addition?
Yeah, just a quick one.
Go ahead.
So potentially with mobile, you could access more people if you advertised it and you didn't have to actually meet them. But on the flip side, I guess you would be potentially limiting the group that you would, socioeconomic groups that you'd be able to access because of the price. So there may be advantages and disadvantages there. So it could be discriminatory. If you wanted a broad, snapshot of society. Sure.
Maybe I would also like to just one point. I think everything has been said, but overall, the mobile-based compared to other is cheaper in terms of especially the admin work and others. If you see the whole, even for the paperwork-based or whatever, it lowers a lot of labor, lots of paper-based work, whatever. So if you see the overall admin cost is so cheap, and the other is rapid, you can get data easily. The paper-based has to be collected, has to be transferred. It takes a lot of time to get data, but this one is very quick. You can collect it and send it to the server, and you can use it. Maybe the other is the disadvantage in terms of usability, as my colleague said, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, as you have shown, it's not less than 30% use of mobile. So even if they have the literacy is very low, so it may be very challenging device to use. And the other is in areas of the designing is also another challenge. Even if they are smartphones, the skill of designing tools using on smartphones is very low. So that could be another challenge or limitation. Yeah.
So just to respond to what you were saying about the different types of consumer groups you will access. What you see from the literature is that people who are more wealthy, higher educated, and younger are more likely to own a smartphone. So that will have an impact on your study population or who you want to include in your study. So that you should also take into account.
I will just continue writing down and summarizing what you said.
So thank you all for giving this feedback on what are the pros and cons, and we've actually encountered basically all of them, I think. So you're quite right on this. And what we want to do today is go into some of the pros actually, and how to use these best. Since we only have a few hours to talk about all of these things, I'm going to limit a little bit what we're going to talk about. A very brief overview of how your research could work. First, you have a research question. At least most researchers usually first have a research question. And then I very much simplified the overview now into that you either want to monitor something or you want to have an intervention. And for now, we're going to focus on the monitoring part. Mainly because this is something you need to really be able to tackle first. What we see often in the field is that people say we want to have a smartphone application, and then we want to change the behavior through that smartphone application, and we want to have proper data. But as soon as you actually start measuring something, and you get feedback on what people have been eating, for example, many people would say this is already an intervention. We also see this actually in the field where we ask people to write down what they've been eating. People start eating differently. So that's why we're focusing on monitoring, and especially today on mapping current local situations. Oh, and by the way, I haven't said this yet. If you have any questions in between, just raise your hand and I will try to answer it. Because maybe I'm using some words that are not really known to everybody, or I'm just not telling the story properly enough. So, as to when to actually use an application on a smartphone, there are a few aspects where it's really useful to start using it. Many of them, I think maybe all of them we've already heard today, but I'm going to repeat them a bit. So the first one is when the moment, location, or other trigger really matters. When you compare it to a web-based questionnaire, for example, you do not know if people are going to be behind their laptop, if you want to have a certain trigger on a certain time, for example. In a certain spot as well. Here in the hallway, we saw some posters with Victoria Station, I think, in London, where you see all the different locations where you can have, I believe I only took a quick look at all snack foods. You can make a trigger that as soon as somebody's there, that the smartphone applications ask a certain question. I'm not saying it's easy to program this, but it is possible. We mainly focus today on certain times, so we want to have an overview of from when you wake up, what you eat and why you eat it, until when you go to sleep. Maybe even your snack consumption during the night. So that's for when the moment, the location, or trigger really matters. Another really important aspect is are within-person variations expected? When you only want to focus on the difference between two groups, you're quite likely not to need a smartphone application, but you can do it much easier with, for example, a paper-based questionnaire. I'm going to get around to more examples of this. And then where a memory bias is expected. This is basically how we started with trying to measure food intake like this. I will also get to an example of this. And whether are carryover effects expected. So, another repetition of when the moment or location or another trigger really matters is that we see we measure, for example, food choice motives. We try to monitor them. And why we did such a complicated way is because we see that this really changes wherever you are or the different contexts, like in between which people you are. What we used to do is indeed just ask what are your general most important food choice motives, for example. So I find animal welfare very important. And if we stick to the animal welfare example, then we see that here's the yellow line. At home, I don't really care about it at all. I just eat all the meat I can, as cheap as possible. However, when I travel, there might be some more people around me, so it grows more important. However, and then when I'm actually in company of my friends, I all of a sudden change into it being very, very important. This is not real, by the way. I always find it important, but just as an example. We also see this in terms of the moments when you're eating something. This is from a paper from, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Machine Errol, from 2014. And here we also see that it differs what you find most important compared to which moment. Are you purchasing something? Are you just having a snack or having dinner? So this is why you can use a smartphone application when it turns rather complex, when you want to have all different situations mapped. The example for when within-person variations are expected, as I said at the beginning, when you're just comparing two groups, in this case, male versus females at exactly the same time, I would advise you not to design a whole smartphone application for this. However, when you see that it changes constantly over time, just like I said, with these different moments or within the different situations, then it's actually quite useful to use one. As an example, this is an overview of how taste preferences vary during the day. These are self-reported taste preferences, by the way. If there are any sensory scientists in this room, I am not one, so pardon me. But you see that, for example, in the morning, people state that they prefer, for example, a sweet breakfast. It's also a Western example, by the way, I see this now. During lunch, it changes in, lunch is then at 12 o'clock, changes into more savory, and then in the evening, I actually think after dinner, there's a preference for something sweet and something savory again. Just to how you can map this during the day. Then my favorite one, where there's a memory bias expected. This was my own food consumption during the day. I made a picture of everything I ate. This was actually not everything, it didn't fit on the sheet. So memorizing, or actually figuring out what you ate the whole of yesterday, or actually in the last 24 hours, is very complicated. I recently participated in a different study, which was about actually my relationship to my son, and they kind of did the same thing, and I noticed, okay, that's actually a good example to use this for, because they asked me how many times I've had contact with my son in the last 24 hours, how much I liked it, and more of those questions where I thought, okay, 24 hours, that started like yesterday night at 6, so in the evening I changed his diaper, and these kind of things. It's very complicated to keep this in mind as a participant. So our solution to this was actually rather easy. We changed it into 2 hours. It does have quite some complications then later onwards if you want to make your research design, but memorizing what you ate in the last 2 hours becomes a lot more easy. That is an example for your memory bias. What we are also often interested in if there are any carryover effects. For example, I used animal welfare before. What we see in practice is that this can also actually it's not dependent on the people you're with, but just how you behave before. If you use I'm looking at Irene right now, she knows much more about this. If you ate something healthy before, you might think, I can compensate this later. If you only look at 1 time 2 hours, then you see maybe really healthy effects, but somebody might compensate this later. The carryover effects can also be the other way around, by the way, positive, but that's a whole different topic. So just to summarize, why use an app at all? We heard this actually already, mainly on that table quite a lot. So you can send prompts to a phone depending on time, location, or any other trigger. And then the other trigger, I just said GPS location, but it's location already in there. It can also be movement. I'm wearing a smartwatch right now. We can also ask for if my heart rate rises, what I've been doing or what I've been eating. Those kind of things are all possible. The automating sampling schemes was also specifically mentioned, and shortening the recall period as a summary. And then I think, your turn again.
Yeah. So now we're going to the next part, in which we're also going to do more exercises on the steps and all the ways you have to think along in designing your own smartphone application. And therefore we use our case study, the ANH study, which I just mentioned earlier. So one of the overall main objectives, what we really want to target, is to stimulate healthy food consumption behavior or healthy behavior. And to do so, you need different insights. You don't actually need only insights on what people are actually eating, but you also need other information. You need more information about the context and also about the reasoning why people are eating or selecting their foods or other I can't pronounce the word. Other determinants that have an influence or an impact on your choice, for example, your own knowledge or your own attitude or your own preference. So what you see here are the 3 main topics that we included in the enrich bot. So we had the actual behavior. In our case, it's food and vegetables. So we need to know what kinds of food and vegetables are consumed. But we don't only need to know what, but we also need to know how much of these food and vegetables are consumed in relation to their portion sizes, but also related to the frequency. So also the situational factors, the context plays an important role. So you can see it about when are food and vegetables consumed. Is it in the morning, during breakfast, is it at lunch or dinner or snacking? As Jos already presented, we see that motives vary across the day. And also where are food and vegetables consumed? Is it at home, on the go, at your work, at school? And we're also interested in the why. Why are foods consumed? So, and in this case, we included the food choice motives, and that are the motives or the reasons why people choose or select foods in general or specific foods. So, to do so, to have these insights in the actual behavior in the food consumption that people have, we were looking for, okay, what kind of data is available? And what we discovered is that there was quite a lack of data about what people are eating, what kind of fruit and vegetables are people eating. And there are different sources that you can use. For example, you can use the FAO food balance sheets to have an idea about what people or what is eating in a country or in a certain location. But you can also use integrated household budget surveys or just other individual research projects. But what is happening then is that the data that is available is often fragmented, it's incomplete, or they used another way of measuring their own food intake data, and it's also not yearly updated. So mostly it's already a couple of years old. So when you really want to know what people are eating, you have to get your data quite fast because the behavior changes. For example, when you look in our case in urban areas. What is also missing is are the situational factors, the context, and the choice determinants. Because mostly in the research domain, we focus only on, for example, on the dietary intake. So these two are also missing. So what we tried to do in our research was to combine both research domains. So the research domains of the dietary intake, but also the research domain of the food choice determinants. And what you see in these two research domains, we all have different tools or different metrics that we use to collect our data. For example, when you look at the dietary intake, you've got the 24-hour recall, you've got the food diaries, and on the other side, we also use a lot of questionnaires in our research domain, or we use lab of natural experiments. But both of these tools or metrics have a lot of drawbacks. So we already mentioned them. So there's a burden for the participants. It takes a lot of time to answer all the questions. And it also takes a lot of time to analyze all the data and make the data available for public. So what we aimed to do was to develop and validate a tool that measures food and vegetable intake and food choice motives of urban consumers in Kenya. So what we did, what we included, was all these three different topics: the food and vegetable consumption, the food motives, and the situational factors into a chatbot. And the chatbot is a smartphone application that's more in a chat form, so that you can have just like WhatsApp or Telegram, so that you have to be like that you're feeling to be in a conversation with each other. So then we're moving to the next exercise, and in that exercise you have to formulate your own research question that you want to answer with a smartphone application. So what you have to take into account is that you think about a case that is related to healthier diets, or if you have another example that's more related to your own expertise or your own project, that's also fine to use. But it's important that you include one of the following conditions, so that the moment, the location, or a trigger really matters. That if you expect within-person variations, where a memory bias expected, or where there are carryover effects expected. So please think about your own topic and your own research question, and we will use that research question in the next exercises. So I hope that it's clear. If not, please raise your hand and we will combine.
So take about 10 minutes to think of something. You can also collaborate with a neighbor, but not like full table roof because I think that's like too much. But yeah, I think you have about 10 minutes to this. Yeah, or you can just think of anything else. Okay.
Wait, actually, you're a bit ahead. That would be the exact question. What you would answer by just, I don't know, standard questionnaires. So it's not about or like digital questionnaires. So for example, if you have tablets or think of something that's really an added value for example, questions related to for example, also that has fun effects. Yeah, might be good because that's
to have made quite some discussions happen here, I see. Quite nice. I told some other people as well, we're not going to test you if you made a good research question or not. They're all perfect. It's mainly to start a discussion. Some things came by already as well as into how I'm going to phrase the actual question to the person and when do I want to measure something. These are the things I'm going to talk about right now. Usually this is not the most exciting part of making your survey or trying to answer your research question. I, on the other hand, always quite like it because it's a little bit of a puzzle. Why it is a puzzle is actually shown a little bit like right in the top right, because we usually want to know quite a lot of people, not the people themselves, but we want to know a lot about them. It's a bit like, we try to do this for the public good, of course, but if you use Facebook as an example, they also want to know as much as possible about you. And they try to make it as convenient as possible for you to give them your data. We try to do the same thing, of course, just in a little bit of a different manner. So the first question I wrote down here is how high can the participant burden be? There was just an example of somebody wanting to map also the food intake over the whole year, but also over the day, and then you can imagine somebody gets burdened quite a lot. So we have some tips of trying to reduce this. We wrote them down into 5 points right here. And so how can you lower the participant burden is to first only repeat variable questions, change wording, use single item questionnaires, avoid open answers, matrices and long text, and use branching to the full potential. I'll go into the examples right now. Of course, there are other examples like a good user interface design, for example. But those are quite general, and these you can usually apply to the surveys you're already used to using and then change them a little bit or sometimes even rather a lot. So what I meant with only use variable questions. A very easy example is somebody's gender is not very likely to change within a week, for example. So you only ask it once. Sounds rather silly, but there definitely have been people that said, okay, this is my questionnaire and I want to see how this changes over time, so I'm going to repeat these questions. And if you give this to a developer that doesn't look at the content, this question will pop up more often, and you are it's quite sure that people will start getting annoyed if you ask them every day what their gender is. So when you do want to repeat some questions is of course if it's likely to change during the day or over a couple of weeks, those kind of things. Changing wording. Most of if you read a scientific paper, quite often the surveys are already not really phrased in a way that everybody can read them quite easily. And moreover, they're quite extensive, so there's long phrases and they're not very specific, so mostly they're asking for something in general. To come back to the example we gave with Fucio's motives, those ask, don't quote me on this because I'm not sure if it's how specifically, but what do you think of this? How do you rate this in general, the importance of animal welfare, for example? So that's the general. You want to make it specific. So you want to ask, how do you rate the importance of animal welfare at this moment, or for what you just chose? Here I also have an example of food list. You need to change that usually as well. If you want to know it very specifically, what we usually do, it's kind of better for your models usually, as we see, but it also increases the burden. So if you're going to make it easier, if you just want to know how many vegetables that you eat and you don't care about which vegetables, it makes it easier for the participant. There are also participants that really want to give you all the details they can give. So this is also something you need to try out before. So simplify your questions, especially long matrices. I've given an example here of what I myself used actually. So on the left side is a question that states, for me the following things were important when I chose what I just ate. It's already specified a bit, but it's still a very long question. And usually you don't want to get this on your phone when you want to answer everything in a few minutes. On the right side, we translate it into something much easier. The other question is, I find the following traits of importance when I normally eat food, and you just click on the ones you find important. On the right side, you're done in an instant. On the left side, you're busy with going through the whole matrix on your phone. Yeah?
But can you press as many of those as you want?
Yeah, we tried multiple versions. We tried one with the maximum of 4, and then many people could fill in everything.
But might it change by the type of food?
Yes, it does change by the type of food. So this context is again important, and also what you just ate, and the analysis becomes different as well, of course, because there you only get a hierarchy, for example, and on the left side you can actually use a 7-point scale, which is usually much easier. It comes down to actually whatever choice you make, you see that you have to give in some and you take some somewhere else. So to avoid open answers, matrices and long text, on the left side is a standard informed consent form that we use at the university. It didn't fit on the picture, as you might have seen as well in your own studies. It's very long. On the right side, I gave an example of the Google version. They managed quite well to make it easier and understandable. I'm not there yet. I'm busy with our legal department and other people to figure out how we can make it so that people can actually read their informed consent forms rather quickly and easily as they'll understand it. So yes, we're not there yet either with having a perfect app. The last one, for the people here, I think rather logical because most of you have been working with surveys already, but use branching to the full potential. The example here I wanted to give is sometimes there's a no answer, for example, have you eaten something in the last 2 hours? And you answer no, you can be done. You can also say, okay, here we're going to ask a few questions that do not need to be repeated, such as what is your gender? And that way you can make the flow a little bit easier and make don't ask all the questions at once, but separate them over a longer period of time. Which comes down to the next exercise. We'll take the same case as before, and then you think about the concept that you actually want to measure. So, can I have one too? So in this case, the concept, I mean, for us it was, for example, the food choice motives. This relates to, for example, health, and as I said, animal welfare, but also the price could be important. And the next question is then, is it a constant or a variable? As the example I gave before, for the food choice motives, we know that they vary over time. By now, we know that some are stable as well. So we try to filter them out, but the constant one is, for example, gender. And how to formulate a question or activity. And then I'm going to refer to a perfect example I had right here. Can I read yours again?
The topic or?
No, your question actually.
So the question to the respondent would be, what did you feed your child yesterday?
He said, what did you feed your child yesterday? Would be a question you can give to your participants. Yeah. Well, not the child in this case, the primary caregiver, very well. I usually don't work with children, as you might have noticed. And we have 10 minutes for this.
So, if I'm interested in trying to, part of this is that, I'm interested in reaching families in a context where they're kind of hard to reach. I want to understand what factors are their food choices plus what they feed their offspring. So, is the concept barriers and providers for healthy foods or diets? There's more, too many. There's two things going on. They choose to eat one thing in their feeding practices.
I think you should make a distinction.
Okay. Oh, is this too broad? Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm mostly, yeah, okay, so this could be one and that would be two. That would be three. I think it's variable.
And when you think just also looking,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
when you look at the next things, do you think affect also
This is
one of these two.
Okay.
It's like they wrote
I
it.
think it's like, I think it's kind of this one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you should keep that in mind. Because when you're interested in one
I'm quite glad to see how motivated you all are in only already writing down your research questions and what you would ask to the participant. Can I use your example of the I cannot pronounce it actually. Schizophrenia.
Oh, schizophrenia. Yeah. Okay.
So not food related at all, but it was the question that you could ask a participant: did you hear any voices in the last, I don't know, it was hour or something like this? If yes, you can actually go into it and show some movies how to deal with it. I like the non-food example in this case. That's actually also how we got to this way of measuring this. It didn't start in food, it started in, I think, psychology indeed, to figure out what is going on at the moment. For example, emotions also fluctuate quite drastically over the day. And we wanted to see if we could also use this technique to figure out what people are eating and why. So more of the puzzle actually, and then you're kind of done with me with trying to figure out what to ask, how often, these kind of things. But some things you need to think about when you want to do this, what is also called ecological momentary assessment. Is if you want to ask it at a fixed time, or if you want to randomize it, for example. Why you wouldn't ask it at a fixed time is that people start knowing when the question would come, anticipating this and maybe changing their behavior. You can ask it at complete random times, but then you don't know for sure if you're going to have like a broad overview, like an actual good average of a day. Then you can also go to stratified random sampling, where you have a couple of time blocks, and then as soon as somebody answered that certain time block, it doesn't pop up anymore, but from the leftover questions, it is randomized. This will become more clear in the other examples. We also need to know what time blocks are. We need to also know when people are sleeping, because you don't want to bother them when they're sleeping, which also poses an issue often, because people with food, for example, people do snack at night sometimes. We also see this in our data that we have on alcohol consumption. We still see that it is recorded less than we expect it to be recorded, because we don't actually send prompts during the night. And we also see some more outliers, of course, which you can expect with alcohol consumption. But that's a totally different topic. What I want to go into now still is the participant burden, what recall periods are, sampling density, and the time blocks that I just mentioned. I'm a bit in front here. So what we call a recall period, I just have been using examples of 2 hours and 4 hours. There was an example of somebody wanting to know more about when people are having breakfast and if they're having it in the right time. Then you can limit this to exactly now or 5 minutes, those kind of things. But as long as you know, a day is rather long if you split it up into a couple of hours, and the more you split it up, the more questions you have to ask, or the larger your sample size needs to be. A phrase you will see in the literature quite often as well is sampling density. On the left side, we see sampling density of like 3 prompts a day. A prompt is, by the way, I haven't said this, if you get this message from your phone. And on the right side, there is only 1 recall, so 1 prompt a day. I have so far not been able to figure out what the ideal amount of prompts per day is. I have also not found any literature. There's only, sometimes it's stated, we assume it's like roughly 3 to 7 times a day. So if you have the answer, please let me know. And then what we call a snapshot is basically a summary of what you see here, the green parts, that we have an average over, in this case, a week. You can compare this to a 24-hour recall, because you get 24 hours, but it is different. The 24-hour recall, of course, actually stipulates 1 day, and I think all the nutritionists here would say we would never do just 1 24-hour recall. We would at least get 2 weekdays and 1 weekend day. I'm also looking to my left where there's an actual nutritionist sitting. Then, we also went into this already just in the assignment, like what would you ask your participant? This example here is from the Enrich project. So we assume here that there's fruits and vegetable intake and that they have some motives to choose this. And the question would be, did you eat fruits or vegetables in the past 4 hours? You can open this, this prompt and then answer yes or no. In case of yes, there would be follow-up questions. We would go into the food choice motives. So there are a few statements popping up, And then there would be certain answer categories. You see here we didn't go quite drastically yet into changing the standard way of asking these questions. We kept to the 7-point scale, from not important at all to very important. To specify a question we had just there, actually, we used Telegram in this case because we were able to program these options. We wanted to use WhatsApp preferably because that was the most used app in this region. Well, we couldn't change anything in that. That's just for communicating between two people, basically. Then we ran into an issue because food intake measurement is so immensely complex that sometimes you cannot program these things rather easily. So we used a link which sent us to our a different piece of software. It's called an in-app browser, I think. So basically people only notice that they have to click on the link and that's it, and the color changes a bit. And there we asked for their food intake. After, actually not their food intake, but their fruits and vegetables intake. After that, the app just closed down when they were finished, and we had the data. Here it says exercise 4, but I think we decided to skip the exercise and I'll just try to explain it to you because it's quite a long one. So when you want to start making your own app, there's a few things you need to think about, like all the things we just talked about. So but also what the participants actually are going to see. So for example, title, what did you just eat? Is this prompt that came up? You need to know what type it is. You can have a timer, a text, a photo entry. I think most people here, they also asked about food consumption, and then I think it should be open text in these cases. We usually use food lists, so we know what kind of food can be bought, and then they can search for it, for example, or we just give a multiple choice answer. If you are going to work with text-based answers, it can be quite a lot of work still, even though you're using an app, because you still need to figure out what people have been writing. A banana can be written in multiple ways I've seen already in the data, and this doesn't only count for bananas. So those are the answering options, for example. You need to think about the trigger, as we said. You can say a certain time. You can use the GPS. You can use how much people have been moving, or heart rate if you have a really high budget, and you can give people smartwatches. These researches also exist. You want to know how many completed prompts you actually need. So we were just talking about the snapshots. Like, what are you defining as a snapshot? Do you only have to have an overview of one day, or do you want to have an overview of multiple days? What you also need to think about if you actually care about that you need to have a total overview of one person, or you're just going to aggregate lots of people and compare groups at the end. Then in the back end, so this is what we would call the front end, what people actually see, and in the back end, you as a researcher can tweak lots of things. You need to think about if you want to do this randomly, on which days, for example, only Mondays, Fridays, or Saturdays, on which time of the day, and when you actually want to send this prompt, for example. It's usually all, it might seem random, but even our random things are never really random. You think about all of these things up front. Are there actually any questions about these things you should think about when you start measuring things multiple times? Go ahead, I'll repeat your question.
There are a lot of groups that are starting to use cell phones more frequently and creating food dictionaries and photos and things like that. Could that be a part of this or not really?
So if it could be a part of this, definitely yes. Like food dictionaries is actually some of my interests at this moment, that people create food dictionaries themselves. It's not my area of expertise, but I do think we should look into what people are using in their, sorry, I cannot think of the names of these apps at this moment, but usually people can fill it in themselves and then say, these are the amount of calories. What we do use already is that people can create certain meals. So if you have a combined meal, it's quite easy to, or for example, if you have a breakfast the same every day, you want to be able to program this as a participant first, like my breakfast is always a yogurt with these grains and a piece of fruit. So then you can instantly click on, this is my breakfast. The downside of it is that people are prone to make it as easy as possible for themselves. So once they've done this, they just think, okay, breakfast, breakfast, breakfast. And as to your last thing, if we can use pictures, there's quite some research done on this topic. In this example, it really doesn't fit because we always ask it afterwards if people ate something. And usually it's gone and you cannot take a picture of it anymore, or at least I don't want it.
Wanted to know your experience of compiling data like pictures, because they are as difficult to be analyzed as text are, because banana can be written in 3-4 forms, and pictures, I mean, picture could be like different types of pictures of same food. So how do you analyze, and how complex it is to analyze pictures? And do you recommend including pictures in the questionnaire?
It's a nice question. We actually had this discussion yesterday during dinner as well. I would not recommend it. First of all, because the food might be gone already, eaten. It's very complex. It's really not my expertise to do any photo analysis. But so far what I've seen is, yes, it's possible, but as soon as like your tea is here in a cup, a photo wouldn't be able to look through the cup of what's in there. Portion size estimation is very difficult, and it still needs quite some computing power. And then a constructed meal, for example. So yeah, the difference between a dal and a soup can be difficult to recognize.
Even picture quality can be different.
Oh,
You may not able to figure out what exactly.
Yeah. The people that I know that are working on this are quite looking forward to the really fancy smartphone cameras with multiple cameras on there, so they can make better 3D models, for example. But no, it's not really there yet to use this in the field easily. Sorry, we're just discussing how much time we still have for our bonus questions. I would first go to the rest of the presentation and maybe at the end we can add.
So yeah, I'm gonna tackle some of the pitfalls, the challenges that we've encountered. I'm gonna address 3 points. Firstly, the development phase, then the data collection, then the data analysis. Oh, okay. So in the development phase, there are a couple of things that you need to address, and I think a lot of them have already been mentioned before, and we've encountered all of these during the ANH project. So first of all, there is the complexity of the questionnaire, and also really related to that, the length of the questionnaire. Yeah, so one thing that's actually quite central to these things that I'm going to mention is that there are different working methods that different kinds of researchers can have. And we were cooperating with another research institute for this, also within Wageningen University. And we noticed that there are some differences in the way we work. For example, we often work with very large data sets. That's one of the differences, and I'll come to that in the next part. But also the complexity of the questionnaire. If you really go into proper nutrition research, there are quite some stuff that you have to take to really make some conclusions. So in that sense, perhaps the questionnaires were more complex than we would have done it ourselves, maybe. Then there is the identification process. I'm usually working with a lot of data, and one of the things that's really annoying is if the IDs are not properly there. And this was also an issue in this project. So I've also had cases before where we thought very well of the IDs, but for some reason it still didn't work out very well. And you would have to, in the end, you end up trying to match people by their email addresses or their phone numbers, but especially in like these kind of countries, people's phone numbers tend to change or they have multiple, and it really becomes a mess. So I would advise you to really think of this very well. Yeah, so what we did here, which is also the way of working that was traditionally done, is that people are sent an ID, and then they get an invitation to download the app. They download the app, they log into the app with this ID and their own password, and then they start inputting their data. And like Jos just showed, if there is external data, then they enter their ID here again. But as you can imagine, people kind of lose things, so yeah, they might also lose their ID, and or they might make typos, and this gets really complicated sometimes. So the ideal situation here would be that obviously the ID is automatically generated. You just send an invitation to the people, they download the app, and as soon as they create an account, an ID is automatically generated. And if you're doing an external survey, this ID is automatically taken there. And you would link it to their account so that people can, if they forget their password, they can just click like I forgot my password instead of having to store it somewhere. And probably would also link it to the account, not to a phone, because people might switch phones in the meanwhile, so it's really useful to have an account for this. Yeah, one more thing that you really have to think of very well is that you are going to get really low response rates and high dropout rates if you're going to use this. Just assume you will. Not only you have to find people willing to be in your research, but you also have to keep them involved. You might want to use incentives to keep them involved, because contrary to when you have a person sitting next to you with a tablet or a paper-based survey, there's nobody to check if people are actually filling it in. So why would you? I mean, I also wouldn't be very likely to respond to all these prompts if I was asked to. Yeah, so this has quite some implications for the analysis you can do. So instead of, if you want to actually do your analysis on 300 people, you might want to aim to get about 1,000 people, because you are going to get really low response rates and high dropout rates. Yeah, link to this. I'm not sure if it was mentioned before, but no, it wasn't, I think. There's also some attrition bias. So which people might drop out? Are these, for example, only the old people that might suddenly stop responding to the prompts? Or I'm not sure, there can be anything. You have to think of this because it will influence your analysis. Yeah, this latter one was mentioned before, it's the selection bias. We've seen it before. It's the percentage, for example, of the people that own a smartphone. It might be associated with their wealth, but also age and education. Yeah, so for the enriched bot, which was sending the prompts, we had a sign-up rate. So of the amount of people that we intended to interview using the bot, 85% of them actually created an account. So we had an ID for them in the data set. Out of all of those people that we intended to interview, the response rate was 48%. So already half of them dropped. And then another time, half of them dropped out because they didn't respond to all of the questions or not enough. So in the end, we only had usable data for the food choice motives for 23% of the respondents that we aim to have. It has to be said this is only in a certain region, because in the other regions, if I recall correctly, there were issues sending out the invitation links, so we weren't even involved, I think, at all. And also, if you look at other studies, you see that also here the same problems are found. I found another study on travel satisfaction in Europe, and even though mobile phone usage is already much more common here and also much more accepted, there are still a lot of issues that you have to think of. People might be really worried about their privacy. And also things like network connectivity. Some areas have low network connectivity and there might be issues with that. Or the ANH might have bugs and it might crash. And these things are all influencing the response rates or the dropout rates. Yeah. So also there they actually had 4 different types of ways to interview people, and they created a game app and a survey app, and they both have very low response rates, and they were used in different cities in Europe. And in some cities, the dropout rate of the survey app was even up to 75%. So you really have to take this into account when you're doing this. And then next is the way the data comes out. Yeah. Yeah. I can. Oh, it's fine.
I was just thinking there could be a pitfall with regards to seriousness of the respondents, because they have to fill it on their own. There is nobody watching them, and there is nobody to, probe. So some of the people may not be serious in filling the entries, so there could be incorrect entries. So how do you deal with these kind of biases? Do you build measures in the application in the questionnaire, or do you make an adjustment in the analysis for taking care of this kind of biases?
I think you were the one that mentioned this before, right, as well? You can definitely, for example, if you're looking into an age of people, if you ask them to enter their age, you can definitely set some ranges, right? So just like in web applications for surveying, you also can enter the respondent cannot be younger than 5 or cannot be older than 115. But also in the data analysis, obviously you look at it, but you will just not be able to spot everything. Because some things might seem realistic, but people were just rushing, for example, because they were like, okay, I want to get this over with really soon. So you can't really know if everything you answer is correct, but you can at least kind of assume if your sample is large enough that this is kind of even that. So I'm always an advocate of really large samples, but that's the ideal situation, of course, which is really hard. Yeah, but I think it's just generally hard to really get to know everything, for sure. Yeah, so finally, there's this. I think this was one of the things that we didn't really think of beforehand, which is if you have such types of apps, it's likely that your data set will not look like you expect it to look. And this is it's not a problem because you can just reshape it. This is called long data. So as you can see, these responses, like a lot of the responses are from the same participants, but then you have the questions, and each question is underneath each other. And in a normal data set, you would have them like right behind each other in a horizontal way. And you need to account some time into this as well to reshape it. It's not super difficult, but you have to think it up front and not get scared when you see this kind of data. Oh yeah, I couldn't find it, I forgot about it. And because if you have a lot of the branching things, a lot of cells might appear empty, but they're actually not empty, of course, because certain decisions were made. So when you're creating your variables, you also have to take this into account. Yeah, and I think we might have to move over for the exercise in a bit, but let's first do this.
So what we presented was the ways that we used in the different kinds of applications that we have been working on in Wageningen Economic Research and in Wageningen University. So we just wanted to show you briefly which kind of different kinds of applications that we have. So the first one is the Enrich bot. So that's a chatbot asking about food and vegetable consumption behavior, so food and vegetable consumption, and also the food choice motives and situational factors. And the next one is the food provider, and it's more a bit of a game app in its design. So it's all about what kind of food products people have been eating over time. So people get also on random moments the question, what have you been eating in the last 2 hours? Next to that, we also enter other questions related, for example, to the motive that I think there is important. But sometimes you also ask some constant questions or some constant variables, for example, gender or age or employment status. They just also randomly pop up in the app just based on how many questions the participant already answered. So if the participants indicated that they already consumed some foods, they already had to make some time in answering all the questions. So we won't ask a question about gender, for example. But if a participant indicates, no, I haven't eaten any food in the last 2 hours, we will pop up such kind of questions just to lower the burden for the participant and to make sure that it's less time consuming for them. And the last one, it's in a project that we're currently working on or running. If I said correctly, it's a track app. It's from a smart food intake tool that tries also to indicate food consumption behavior over a certain time period. It also has a different kind of prompts, but a different way of answering the data. So it's not in a chat way, but more in a diary way. And this is an example of making your own dishes, what Jos was just talking about, for example, for breakfast, so that you can always enter the same breakfast if that's what you usually eat. So what you can see from this is that we're really searching and we really don't know what is the best way of collecting data on food intake, and we're just searching for the best solution. So, so then we have still 15 minutes left. So I think we can go to the final exercise. And that's based upon all the 2 exercises before. And in this case, we will draw a mock-up. So you've got here on the right or the left, it doesn't matter, the front end, and the other side is the back end. So what you will do is draw the questions into the smartphone, so to see how the participants would see your questions and what kind of answering possibilities there are. And then you also have to think about how it should look at the back end. Is it clear?
No. Draw or write?
It's more about the questions related to the prompts. So it's.
Can I answer this one?
Yeah.
So the front end is really what the participant sees, and the back end, it doesn't matter what it looks like, but just write down your own decisions. Like, I want to repeat this question 10 times. I want it to be there on a Monday morning and a Tuesday morning. That's it. Those kind of things. And to the front end, here we just had a nice discussion as well. You don't need to have a question per se. It can also be a picture that you swipe left or right. In this case, it was also about food. You might have seen this example already in an app called Tinder, if you're single. Think about these creative ways of making it easier for your participants.
This one, drawing from how you